All right. Hi, guys. Welcome to the open quarterfinals of Sundo 2025. My name is Gelson. I'm your chair for this round. This real quick in order of attack. Can I have panelists introduce themselves?
Hi, my name's Atifa. I'll be paneling today. Good luck for the debate and congrats on getting to quarters.
Hello, everyone. My name is Srishti. I usually have pronouns. Good luck, everyone.
All right. My name is Gelson. I'm a chair for this round. I use him pronouns, but prefer if you refer to the panel as a whole. Once again, congrats on making it this far. Couple of things to get through. Firstly, if you have any preferences you'd like to announce, including gender pronouns or play preferences, feel free to do so at the beginning of your speech. Also, I will be timing you, but I won't be putting timestamps in the chat. So feel free to time yourselves as well as the speaker currently speaking. That's it. If there are no further questions for the round, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open up the debate for all of us. Here.
Am I visible and audible?
You are, yeah.
POS verbally, please. The Republican Party doesn't need good policy to win. All they need is Trump dancing on stage, moving his hands in a specific way, doing theater. And let me tell you, when this bill will be the theater production that manifests all of the Republican Party's promises. The first piece of framing is to understand the bill beyond the info slide. The first thing is these spending cuts targeted at welfare programs like Medicaid, food stamps, and housing assistance. These are programs that Republicans have historically framed as rife with things like fraud and abuse. Secondly, is tax cuts that are targeted at small businesses and certain middle income households, with a larger share of relief going to business owners and investors instead, feeding into the free market capitalist theory of the Republican Party. Thirdly, it's minimal direct investment in public services with the implicit argument that private sector growth will eventually trickle down. But fourthly, it's a marketing-friendly name, right? It's deliberately in Trumpian language, big, beautiful, and is designed for repetition in your stump speeches and your conservative media sound bites that Ben Shapiro and all these other people are going to put out. But fifthly, it's built to look like you're solving an economic problem, reducing the deficit, which I'm pretty sure most Republicans don't even know what the fuck that means, while actually locking in GOP economic ideology of low taxes but reduced welfare spending. But you don't just need to rely on this to understand why like Trump voters are stupid, Judge. I'll get into that later as well. But secondly, what is this debate about? We aren't asking if this is going to be economically sound, socially just, or whatever. We are just asking, firstly, does it advance the political interests of the Republican Party, both now in a post-Trump era? But secondly, what political interest means here is probably electoral viability, voter loyalty, your donor satisfaction, and also your ability to consolidate your ideology. The first question that I want to answer then is, what is the reality of the Republican Party? Let's be blunt. GOP-based voters are highly responsive to narrative over numbers. They want to see visible wins for their side and losses for the other side. That is why the Republican Party is able to weaponize things like culture wars, like anti-abortion, anti-trans stuff and shit like that, and still get away with it. But secondly, they have decades of conditioning to see things like welfare recipients as lazy or undeserving. So cutting these programs is framed as justice rather than harm. But thirdly, they identify strongly with small business culture, even when they are not owners themselves, right? They want to see as if they're doing tokenistic help to like the poorest and the most marginalized, but they don't care about the most marginalized of individuals, because otherwise they would be in favor of welfare programs that the Democrats are promising. But fourthly, their loyalty is anchored in identity politics. They will repeatedly vote Republican as long as the party delivers symbolic blows to the Democrat priorities, even when Trump has been indicted, even when Trump has been like a literal sex offender, even when Trump has been convicted of giving hush money to things like porn stars. This has still not broken the Republican support for Donald Trump. Why does this framing matter? Because opposition will say this harms people, it alienates moderates. That is irrelevant because number one, the GOP base is energized and will still turn out in high numbers at the election, especially when you're able to weaponize populist talking points. But secondly, the bill locks in structural advantages like donor dependency and narrative dominance. The second question that I want to get into in my speech is, how do we get immediate voter satisfaction? Before that, go CEO.
Yeah, this just makes all of your analysis completely symmetric. Like, if it's true that people are going to be Republican either way, why don't you just pass a counterfactual bill, which is actually
Yes, I'm
good for
getting
the
into that.
economy?
Yeah, you did. Yeah. So, firstly, how do we get immediate voter satisfaction? The claim here is that this is a concrete delivery on Trump's biggest repeated campaign promises. Things like tax relief, things like deregulation, things like cutting waste and prioritizing business growth over government handouts, which cements that short-term loyalty. Three ways to prove this. Firstly, it's a symbolic follow-through. Your base has been primed for years to see big, beautiful deals and draining the swamp as key proof of competence. If you pass this bill, there is a tangible proof of delivery and not just rhetoric that the Democrats often accuse you of. But secondly, it's short-term material wins. Small business owners and your middle-income households in red and like swing states will be able to see lower taxes on their paychecks within months. This reinforces the perception that we get shit done, unlike the people on the other side that I like that hold office, like they accuse Biden of not doing anything in the wheel and being sleepy Joe Biden. This proves that they are proactive when it comes to policies. But thirdly, it's the narrative framing. You can run ads and you can run rallies with a simple message: promises made, promises kept, keep America great. The bill becomes an election slogan rather than a policy white paper. Four impacts to this. Firstly, it results in a base enthusiasm spike. Core voters are more likely to canvass, you're more likely to donate, you're more likely to turn out in your primaries and your midterms and all the talks that you have in your like shitty Bible Belt states and stuff like that when they believe their candidate when they believe that their candidate is able to keep those promises. But secondly, you have swing reinforcement in your key blocks, small business owners, independent contractors, and your suburban households who benefited in 2017 when Trump got into power are now reminded of those dates. Trump can then run on those same nostalgic narratives that he has always run his campaign on. Look at like we are back in the good times of 2017 and the pre-COVID, pre-Democrat era where they fucked everything up. But thirdly, it's your long-term narrative benefit. A lot of the criticism of the Democrats towards Republicans is they don't get shit done, don't pass policies that help people, and only engage in culture war. This acts as a proof that you do, and you can springboard the ability of future candidates to work on this particular springboard to say, you voted us once and we got shit done, vote for us again and we'll continue getting shit done. The way in here is that even if this fucks up the economy and is bad for Republican voters, firstly, what is some mitigation? Number one, these things can still work. We can incentivize more local production. We can protect current industries within the economy. And this gives a lot of room for like paper economic outcome. And these are likely going to be the things that you can reference when you bring it up in like your debates and stuff about why Republican conservative economic policy can make. But secondly, I've already proven to you why these people probably don't care about the economic impact based on the framing. But thirdly, it's posturing that when Democrats attack you, you can frame the problems that you did solve, corruption, inefficient spending, as the best and most important problems that you needed to solve when you got into power. But even if it really fucks up the economy, what's the comparative? They're not going to vote for the Democrats that are going to reinstate Medicaid or US aid in developing countries. They won't vote for the Democrats that are pro-abortion and pro-trans laws. So the conclusion is, since Republicans eat up shit all the time, this will be the most perfect shit cake with a cherry on top. The second argument that I want to get into before I end my speech is how do we cement that GOP identity for the long term then? Few mechanisms to this. Firstly, your business owners, your energy firms, and your lobbyists and stuff like that who are set to gain from this particular bill will cement themselves as long-term GOP donors and allies. If you roll back this bill, that becomes politically toxic, as what happened with like Reagan or with Bush and stuff like that in the past, which like Republicans are heavily disassociating from, like especially current generation Republicans. But secondly, this empowers the GOP ability at the state. Republican governors and state legislatures can claim credit for this local growth that's tied to this bill, especially when it comes to tax relief or boosting down ballot performance. What this can act as is your a certainty, not just in your success in future general elections, but also in the midterms that are going to come soon, right? But also post-Trump era, where you probably are going to see other candidates springboard on those same narratives. This just cements your identity. It consolidates your ideology. This has never been better for the Republican Party.
All right, thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now to open up the op bench, I invite the leader of op. Here, actually, wait, let me pause the recording first. All right, to further the Gov bench, I invite TPM. Here.
Long-term 10 to years.
Am I visible and audible?
You are, yeah.
Okay, give me a second. I think the problem with this opening opposition team is they debate in a manner that isn't in tandem with the way US politics, and in particular the Republican Party tends to work. Because a lot of their assumptions are crucially things that are preempted by Ahsan's speech in explaining that they are seen as relatively unimportant issues to the average like Republican American or the average center-right American. So this is the first call out. Things like business cuts, things like all the things that they say about Medicaid are likely not going to be perceived in the ways that they argue that this is going to manifest for two key reasons. The first is that cuts to Medicaid and cuts to spending can be seen as principally justified via Republican policy, but also justified in the practical implications that these policies have. Because the cuts to Medicaid, as framed by Republicans, is typically cuts to things like transforming care, things like abortion rights. All of these things are seen as massive wins to the Republican Party. But the second reason why this is likely going to be seen as good is simply because beyond the ideas of principle, it's seen as something that is consistent with the ideas of Trump. Things such as calling out the Democrats for doing nothing to change economic policy. Things like giving weaponization towards the future candidates to be able to attack any policy or any recommendations that the Democrats do. Incisively then, the reason why this is a good policy is twofold. The first, as we explained to you, is that it guarantees an outcome in the midterm election. This allows the Republicans to do the things that they wanted to do, such as gerrymander, such as increase the number of Supreme Court justices that are in place to filibuster their courts. All of these things are capacity incentives that explain to you why the Republican Party has an incentive to do this. At the very, very worst case, in the short run, this does lead to some level of detrimental harm, but the point of Republican classical economic policy was always about the long run, always about saying that this is long run supply side policies that are meant to see some level of future benefit and future level of utility towards the public. No, thank you. The second call out I have is towards the entirety of op bench, because I want to note that OO and by extension CO can't get away with this idea of simply saying that if this is a symmetrical issue and if the policy has no real relevance towards Republican support, therefore they don't need to do anything. The burden of opposition in this debate is to explain, Judge, why this is something that is a burst to Republican incentive, why this is something that is bad. In tandem with this, a large chunk of LO's speech can be disregarded because it isn't arguing that it's a bad counterfactual. It's arguing that it's a value-neutral counterfactual. That's not the burden of this opposition. So insofar as we prove a level of utility and a level of benefit to the Republican Party, we're already winning the first speaker exchange. Three issues I want to talk in my speech then. The first is why this is better for the Republican support base. We tell you that it is better for the Republican support base because of the kinds of ways that it empowers the people on the ground, the kinds of ways it tells people and converses that, look, we as a party fulfill our promises. The second reason that we tell you is that this is particularly in tandem with the ideas of the Republican Party and the promises that Trump made. The third is that this is packaged in a very sexy way. Calling it a one big beautiful bill is very in line with the populist rhetoric that not just Trump uses, don't let LO get away with this, but all the people in the Republican Party use as well. That the majority of Republican leadership and in tandem the political supporters and political talking points like Turning Point USA all support these kind of rhetoric and talking ideas. So concisely, we've already proven to you to an extent that this is something that's likely going to be good. Don't buy this idea that because it's cutting things that Republicans have hated for the longest time anyway, that O talks about, that people are suddenly going to be angry with this. If you told me as an Indian person that they're going to be cutting aid for another group in Malaysia and then giving that aid to me, I would be Indian people would be like, wow, that's amazing. This is the same line of logic. What then is the extension that I want to provide here? The first is why this is unique and an independent pathway towards greater amounts of Republican support. The first is because you are directly helping the lobbying groups that make up the biggest incentive and biggest finances of your campaigns. Things like Apple, things like Google. Historically, Judge, these are the people that have supported the Republican Party the most. Tim Cook literally donated $100 billion to the US economy on the promise that this bill is likely going to be passed. The second, or the ideas of narratives and fulfilling the promises. Note, Judge, that this is precisely why the bill is named this way and enacted this way. Because it's supposed to be a big and beautiful ideation onto the American economy. This is precisely where you get deliverance. The third is that why centrist people are likely going to perceive this as good. I have three vague ideas as to why this is likely going to be good. The first is that identifying who the centrist Trump and Republican supporters typically are. These are typically the upper middle class. These are typically rich business owners. These are typically small business owners. Why will they perceive this as good secondarily then? Number one, because this is directly giving them increased amounts of support. Number two, it's greater amounts of liberalization to incentivize trade. Number three, it's inherently framed as protectionist policy, meaning local businesses are very likely going to support and fund you. Why is this tipping point? Number one, because campaign support in the form of lobbying gives you the greatest amount of airtime, ability to go to talk shows, ability to talk about things on a very fervent stage. All of these things mean that the Republican base is not only emboldened in just the number of voters, but its capacity to campaign against democratic support. Weigh this against any contention that comes from their side that doesn't include the proponents of this bill, because it is exclusively through this bill where the CEOs of company fund you for hundreds of billions of dollars. Sure.
Your claim is that people who think abortion are murder are not going to show up to the midterms. But if you think abortion is murder and that like welfare recipients don't deserve any money, you're probably voting Republican either way, and you're going to go to the polls either way. So this doesn't matter at all. Also, it can't be perceived as both liberalizing trade policy and being more protectionist. You have to choose one of these two mechanisms.
Number one is like a POI. If you want to talk that much, like your speech, you're welcome to do it. But number two, you're not listening to my speech either, because I've literally told you that it isn't just about the voter bases. It's about perception, number one, to the voter bases, if you care about that so much. But number two, it's about the capacity to enact your policy, the capacity to talk about things, the capacity to go on talk shows. So unless you have a weighing, which I've already weighed to you, by the way, about the hundreds of billions of dollars that you're potentially going to gain from these tech CEO companies, then I don't think that that POI is one that's incredibly valid in the round. Second issue I want to talk about then. Can this bill be somewhat economically, or at least symbolic economic-wise good? I want to extend on this in two key fronts. The first is to understand what Republicans want economically. They're typically classical economists or neoclassical economists. So they typically think about little spending in the economy. They think about the freedom of the markets. They think that the capitalist economy is the best way to go forward. Two max to explain why this bill makes it viable. The first is the ability for you to posture that you're doing the exact things that the economy needs to go. I want to note here, Judge, that it isn't about what the potential outcome is going to be. It's about the idea that the Republican Party can now say, we've given the fullest extent of liberty towards you to behave in a capitalist market. Anything that you do choose to do is up to you, and therefore we've given you the amount of greatest ideas of agency. The second reason why this is good is it gives you the capacity to call people out, because you can say, sure, we've enacted some policy, it's not perfect, but the Democrats haven't enacted their version of a big beautiful bill, so clearly they don't care about Americans, which is exactly what Trump is going to say. Why is this thing likely going to lead to a lot of good symbolic economic wins? Number one, because it's precisely where the Republican Party can say that they're fulfilling the truest amounts of their quota. But number two, this extends beyond Trump. This extends beyond the idea of his presidency, because number one, it gives you a secure way to win the midterms, because the voter bases that are typically apathetic to the lack of direct action being taken now see action being taken. But number two, they see it on the potential of the Republican Party being the party that enacts policies that are in line with what it always told it was going to do. Sure, there are shitty people that cut trans rights and don't believe that people deserve to have abortions, but that's exactly what their voters eat up anyways.
All right, thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now to further the op bench, I invite the dialogue. You here?
Am I audible?
You are, yep.
Yeah, give me a minute. Okay. Sorry, let me arrange my notes. POI is in chat. Okay, where's my Zoom window? There you are. Okay. The problem with the OBBB is that it threatens to reveal the oasis that's actually sand. It threatens to turn up the heat too fast on the comfortable frog, and it threatens to jump out of the pot at the point that you turn it up too fast. Carriers and other things continue to uphold the illusion without hurting people. It still hurts them, but not enough to burn them to not want to vote for you. The first thing I want to show is that voters can care about the economy. Is to show that voters care about the economy more than the drain the swamp narrative. The second thing I'm going to do is to show why the drain the swamp narrative is actually more effective on our side of the house. The third thing I'm going to do is to weigh in terms of why specifically this is a lot better for the longevity of the Republican Party. The first thing that they talk about is that voters are irrational. This is true for both sides, and I think Anders does a good job in the POI to point it out. There's still not broken support for Trump. So voters can have two incentives to support Trump or get them out. The first thing I'm going to prove is that draining the swamp narrative has actually dampened in terms of like an effective strategy. The first is because the reality is hitting. Florida created an entire camp for illegal immigrants, but Republicans are actually seeing the arrests happening and people dying. This hits hard, because no matter how much of a how much you want these Mexicans gone. At a point in which you see actual people die in front of you, actual people get deported in front of you, the reality sets in that they are no longer an amorphous concept, but actual things that happen to you at the same time. But also seeing money for their hospitals, from their jobs, going to staffing these things instead of benefiting them, also then literally means that they have no jobs. They see the benefits literally go away. This is an important response because the economy directly ties into how people vote. Have Republicans saying that they hate immigrants but not that much? Have Republicans saying that they hate immigrants but not at the cost of their jobs? These are the kinds of narratives right now that the average Republican has. The partition lines have been broken at a point in which the partition lines at a point that implemented the reality has set. The second is that because they're tied to Trump cannot run anymore. JD Vance is a loser. MTG is a screaming fool. None of them are as charismatic at a point in which that these things, like these narratives, can only be done specifically by Trump. At a point they repeat them, most Republicans look at them with distaste. This is objectively true. The approval ratings for JD Vance and MTG and every other Republican Party member has significantly plummeted at a point in after every single debate that they have had. If anything, they're seen as they're seen by the Republican parties as shills, as people who abandon the party at the first step of the way. Last thing, we can do it too. Tariffs and drain the swamp narrative, but without any of these things. So the important nuance in OO's case is that this is the thing that, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I'll prove to you, and the politicians specifically will still be platformed. It's bizarre. I mean, OG says that without this, you will not be on talk shows. The world is literally such a thing. It wastes money, but not too much. Cutting of Roe v. Wade, for example. Very simply, you can just cut funding specifically from the trans healthcare without cutting in any more healthcare. You can just directly cut the trans funding. I'm not sure why specifically you as a Republican Party need to cut every single essential bill's funding. They cannot just say that this is the only thing that exists that gives them platforming. This is just patently untrue. Plus they're politicians. Plus they also own Fox News. Plus there's a bunch of other things that they can do that is not the OBBB. One is specifically that tariffs and other things actually cost less. The first is because the EU and EU's trade deals have not retaliated. So most other countries have settled on a 10 to 15% tariff and have not retaliated. This is important because the main way in which prices increase significantly is specifically through retaliation, but no country has done it in fear of mutually assured destruction. This means your average prices of goods and services have actually maintained quite okay. The stock market hasn't crashed. So this is probably why a lot of these things are fine. The second reason for why this is fine is because this is literally spread across many people. Perceptually, people only get a small increment in price because it's spread among many people and the risk is high and the risk is low. Lastly, it's more insidious versus the immediate hit by the OBBB. Your price increase in eggs, you heave a sigh of regret. Yes, sir, no doctors. Yes, sir, no teachers. Yes, sir, your unemployment versus your food stamps being taken away. All of these are super impactful versus the slight increase in prices from tariffs that still give you the same perceptual value. This is important because those things are more perceptually good at a point that people cannot feel and cannot see the kinds of actual impacts that are happening. Those things happen in the background, only actualize much more later. But the second thing is a lot more proximate on the other side of the house. At the point that this bill is implemented, you will see the effects immediately. That's the problematic because this shatters the illusion specifically that you are doing good for them. The last thing they say is cook and will give you donations. Money that is given to them doesn't buy votes. If anything, it's the opposite. When people saw Tim Cook donate money, this shattered again the illusion that the Republican Party was for the people. The problem is that the Republican Party's main selling point, independent of Trump, is that we are for the people. We are against immigrants. We are insular. But we are also technically against rich people. The problem is that you shatter the illusion at the point in which that rich people are actively donating to these campaigns. This means your average person on the ground is likely to not want to vote for you at the point that you are now a capitalistic shill. Why is it specifically that we make it worse for the average person? It hurts essential services, hospitals being defunded, but your poor person is very hurt. And this, important framing as well. Rural Bible Belt states like Alabama are the biggest beneficiaries of your food stamps, are your biggest beneficiaries of your of government spending. At the point you cut government spending in the most rural areas because your rich states like New York, for example, and California already have their own reserves and they don't need these kinds of things. This necessarily also means that the majority of your voters in rural belt areas and Bible Belt states are the ones that are likely to most revolt against the Republican Party at the point you pass this. Lastly, it's not investment. Some profitable things like the steel industry. This is unique because other bills, again, don't do this. We have to move on to the counterfactual. OG or CG, anything.
So this doesn't negate from the idea that the one big beautiful bill is postured as a bill that is an all-encompassing bill that is easy to comprehend for a very lack of nuance voter base.
But we can posture in other ways. The problem with this posturing is they posture so hard your spine breaks. And it's at a point that you posture so hard to the point that your voter base finally realizes that you are stupid. So this hurts investment as well because funding goes towards unprofitable things like the steel industry, and it also means that your locals also see that they're not getting jobs. You are major layoffs specifically at a point your industry cannot sustain itself. In the next 4 years, at a point that these industries keep laying off people, then they also get this illusion anyways in the long term. Let's weigh this. They get so potential improvement, but talking of impact, should Trump voters care about food stamps? At the point there's no food or healthcare, kind of bad, yeah. Versus a small increase in perception. Defunding of healthcare doesn't change the fact that your doctor hit you. Defunding of trans healthcare doesn't change the fact that you have no doctors at the point that you have a fever. You tell people you defund trans healthcare, but people go to hospitals and are like, ah shit, I cannot find a doctor. Surely the second one outweighs the first one. If you're gonna choose between one of maybe you fund some trans healthcare but get some doctors, that's fine. Such exclusivity. We have perception things other alternatives versus your voter base when once you lose them, you cannot return them back because those things are very deep. For all these reasons, opening opposition.
All right, thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now to open up the closing half, I invite the member of Gao. Here.
Hi, can I just check that I'm audible and visible?
You are, yeah.
Thank you. I'll take my pure eyes verbally. Thanks. The unfortunate reality is that Trump has irreversibly tied himself to the Republican Party. There is no future of the party without Trump. They will never be free from the specter of his legacy, nor do they want to be free of it. I'm going to do a few responses to break the opening deadlocks. The first thing I want to deal with is the reframing from DLO on why Republicans are losing support. We think this is untrue. What they tell you is that they are losing support because, for example, you see the tangible outcomes of immigrants being rounded up by ICE in front of you. We think the reason why this doesn't lead to them losing support is because the extent to which it stirs up the fervor of the Republican Party. It stirs up the deep wells of hate that they have against these people. The intuition pump here is that they literally sell alligator Alcatraz merch. We think they are deeply gleeful about the fact that they can see these depths of impact against the minorities that they hate so much. The key framing here is that the Trump party thrives on extremism. We think O fails to engage on this. But we think we're going to deal with how the average person responds to the economic impacts, because what OO tells you is that in the long term, the outcomes of the economic impacts are going to be extremely harmful to the average person. The first thing I want to deal with is on the idea of Medicaid and how much it hurts the average person. We think what OG fails to do here is deal with the scope of OO, because OO rightfully calls out that the cuts to Medicaid are not just about trans and abortion care. So we're going to actually engage on the worst case here and provide a vertical extension on why even when healthcare becomes more expensive to the average person, this is less important to them than, for example, tax cuts to small businesses. The first reason for this is on things like proximity. Medicare is something that only activates when you have a healthcare emergency. This is something that the average person never thinks that they're going to need. They never think that they will have an emergency where they need to spend long months in the hospital. They never think that they're going to get cancer. Because of this, it's not something that they feel very proximate to their voting patterns. We think it only affects people who are already sick, for instance. Compare this to the daily life of tax cuts to your businesses. We think this is something that feels far more proximate and far more important to these individuals. But secondly, the reason why it's easy to let go of Medicaid is because there is a villainization aspect here. What Trump tells you is that the people who are using Medicaid the most are those who are poorer than you. So they are suffering more. This is something that helps even poor individuals in the Rust Belt, because they always feel that there is someone worse than them, someone who is taking more of the state's resources that they want to screw over. We think this is a narrative that Trump is able to play into still. But secondly, I'm going to fill in the gaps here on the demographic of the average Trump supporter or the average Republican Party supporter. I think we're going to fill in the gaps here on OG's characterization to form a vertical extension. The first thing we want to note is this rural and Midwestern voters. We think DLO tells you that the Rust Belt is the biggest beneficiary of these Medicare and food stamps, and therefore they're going to be most affected by this. I think I want to note here that these Midwestern people are also the biggest benefits of tax cuts to small businesses, because they are the rural farmers, they are the ones who are engaged in family businesses, for example. But also note why helping their businesses is more compelling to them than helping them through food stamps. It's because of the narrative of the Midwest. This is a vertical extension because OG doesn't provide this. We think that the ideology of the Midwest is a concept that you want to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You don't want to live in a welfare state. You don't want to be dependent and suck resources from the state. Because of this, they would rather that they get tax cuts that help them to be self-sufficient through their small businesses than that they have to keep taking food stamps from the state. For this reason, we think that they are still likely to buy into this big, beautiful bill narrative. But secondly, I'm also going to do the framing here on why precisely these people are super democratically illiterate, because I think OG asserts this but doesn't do the full length to prove this. The first reason is because of cocoons of misinformation. The fact that you're on social media, the fact that your algorithm only provides you with Trump propaganda. But secondly, we also think that Trump propaganda machine is one that's incredibly effective because people don't really listen to other parties besides him. We think they listen to Trump pundits, for instance, that only push one particular narrative. Because of this, we think it's incredibly easy for Trump to frame out long-term economic narratives. Because even if people feel the long-term economic burn, as OO wants to say, we think this is still something that Trump can blame other things on, right? He can say it's not the big beautiful bill, it's actually China that's making you poor. And this is something that people are incredibly inclined to believe. But we also want to push the comparative here that deals with OO's case, because OO wants to distinguish the Republican Party versus Trump. The important context here is that the Republican Party has already tied itself to Trump. There are two reasons for this. The first is that we think the MAGA movement as a whole is inextricable from Trump, given that he has built a cultist support base specifically around the MAGA movement. The Republican Party has been tied to the MAGA ideology for years at this point. This is something that they cannot run away from even in the future. But the second reason for this is that the future leadership of the Republican Party are likely to be Trump cronies anyway. We see that he is systematically eliminating everyone from the Republican Party who doesn't agree with him. So the future Republican leaders have no desire to distance themselves from Trump, as OO wants to claim. And because Republican voters perceive that the next leader has Trump support, they are still likely to tie that legitimacy of Trump to the legitimacy of the Republican Party. Why do you lose support if you can't pass the bill then? Because I think this is the comparative that Op doesn't want to deal with. We think Trump loses legitimacy at the point at which it seems like he cannot do anything. This, by extension, means that the Republican Party loses legitimacy, because it means that for a decade by this point, they have backed a leader who cannot get anything done. This, in the long term, hurts the Republican Party more on their side of the house at the point at which they are seen to have less performance legitimacy, at the point at which they are seen to be equivalent to Democrats. I'll take a POI.
So the funding of government sectors are quite immediate in the removal of jobs versus tech cuts, which takes time, but also in the long term loses more jobs because they're unprofitable, as given in OO. Given that this policy must last for another 4 more years, why take the trade-off?
Okay, thank you. I think I've already proven why, even if you suffer, even if you lose jobs, this is something that Trump can weigh off, right? He can be like, you're losing jobs because of immigrants, and now I'm going to deport immigrants, and so I'm going to fix this. People don't actually know what is causing them to lose jobs. It is very easy for Trump to wave this off. Moving on to our horizontal extension then on why Democrats become incredibly demoralized. Two important pieces of context. We think post-Trump election, immediately post-Trump election, there was a renewal of Democratic fervor because they were so horrified. This looks like the No Kings movement. This becomes dangerous to the Republican Party precisely because the Republican Party is trying to engage in things like democratic backsliding, because they're trying to cement control. This is going to be impossible if the Democratic Party and the Democratic voters manage to rally and push back against it. The mechanism for why the big beautiful bill prevents this is because it erodes democratic fervor on our side of the house. At the point at which American politics becomes a war of attrition, becomes a war of how can we make the Democrats give up, we think that is only done on our side when the big beautiful bill is able to create massive erosions in their support base. The frame here is that there is increasing mass disillusionment on the Democratic support base because there is already the existing perception that the Democratic Party was super inefficient, that Joe Biden was unable to achieve anything. Note that this is the extension on OG's case because they provide you this framing but never tell you why it is important. We think the impact on our side of the house is that the Democrats become demoralized. Firstly, you decimate their support base. Secondly, the structure of the party also weakens. This looks like Harris refusing to run again because she released a statement on how disappointed she is in the US populace. This means that the Democratic Party can no longer provide a viable challenge to Trump. Trump becomes uncontested and by extension the Republican Party. All of these reasons, CG.
All right, thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now to open up the closing half for Op, I invite member of Op here. All right.
problem with all houses in this debate is that they underestimate the strength of the Republican propaganda machine. I don't think they fully conceptualize how influential this model is. I don't think they fully conceptualize how exactly people buy into this propaganda. And I think this is the central clash in this debate, which is why I'm going to posit to you that the material that actually provides to you actually breaks this deadlock. Before moving on, a couple of ancillary responses. I think CO comes up here and tells us things like, oh, currently, like, people quite like Biden, and then afterwards, Biden did a lot of great things, etc. Right? I think the first thing that I want you to know is that people don't like Biden that much. I think ultimately the view of the Democratic Party was never that good to begin with, to the point where the Republican Party truly felt that perhaps that this big beautiful bill would completely ruin everything that the Democratic Party did. Because I don't think people recognize that the Democratic Party did anything to begin with, for two reasons. The first thing here is that Biden existed during the COVID era. So between him lowering inflation rates and seeing your mom dying in a hospital bed alone, I think people quite evidently blamed Biden even more, as per the mechanism that people like to blame the government. I think the second reason here is about the media power asymmetry that currently exists. So here's where we talk about the Republican propaganda model, which is something that I'll explain a bit more later on. I think there exists a power asymmetry between the ability of the Republican Party to weaponize the media and frame narratives against the Democratic Party. I think people are extremely susceptible to that. There's a missing frame that OG doesn't actually give you, which CG fills in the gaps for. Then moving on to the central clash here, on why is it then that people are actually very susceptible to the Republican propaganda model, and why then does this influence the way that people react to the big beautiful bill? Two reasons for this, right? I actually told you things like the demographic of the Republican support base. We told you about things like how they're rural and Midwestern people, how they see the economy as a zero-sum game, right? So if they see cuts to Medicaid and if they see cuts to Medicaid but tax cuts to their businesses, they're more willing to accept this Medicaid cut. But even things like how the narratives of the Midwest, how you want to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, I think these are all reasons as to why is it that the Trump voter base is likely to like the big beautiful bill. But the second thing then on why is it that the average swing voters and the average citizen is still likely to fall prey to this model, which is something that CO doesn't want to engage on, which is about the idea of the decentralization of our information right now. We told you that we currently live in a post-truth society. This means that whenever we go online, we see things like sensationalism, we see things like certain echo chambers being formed. We don't trust the information that we see anymore because we don't know what is real. We don't know whether or not the information that we are consuming is actually facts, whether it's actually factual. The information game that is currently going on in reality becomes one about narrative, becomes very opinionated based, it becomes very emotionally charged. It's all about rhetoric, it's never about facts anymore. And this has two impacts, right? The first impact here, and this is us being extremely charitable to this idea that perhaps people won't become extreme, is that the average person just doesn't know where to get their information from anymore. In a sea of information, in a sea of opinions, in a sea of rhetoric, the average voter just becomes apathetic. This is why you see swing voters in the US now refusing to pick for any party. And this is the best case on CO and on opposition, where people simply don't want to engage with politics anymore. We think that in these instances, even if you lose out on the swing voter support for MAGA, Trump, the Republican Party isn't likely to suffer from this big, beautiful bill to begin with. But I think the second more important extension that Ashley told you is the idea that you actually get more extremism, right? Because insofar as there are so many echo chambers being formed, when there's so many when there's so many narratives that are being pushed out, we told you that the type of echo chambers that you are likely to fall prey into as the average swing voter is going to be the extreme ones, precisely because of the fact that MAGA is able to use flashpoints, they're able to use sound bites, they're able to use things like Turning Point USA, like Jubilee, to legitimize their extreme views because of how controversial it is, because of how sensationalized it is. We told you that these are the types of things that are likely to go viral compared to things like fact-checking, compared to things like people telling you why the big beautiful bill sucks. I think because of this information asymmetry and the types of information that is likely to be promoted, you as the average swing voter, as the average person who doesn't care about politics, is likely to fall into extremism. You are likely to fall into this MAGA narrative. You are likely to support Trump and the Republican Party. We think this, in turn, is in the interest of the Republican Party, right? I think second thing I want to talk about then, why is it that the extension that actually told you about taking down the Democratic Party is a key agenda of the Republican Party? And this is the missing frame that OG doesn't give you, right? Because we told you that you cannot discuss the Republican Party without the Democratic Party. The Republican Party does not exist without the Democratic Party as an enemy. Two reasons for this. The first thing here is the idea that the Democratic Party is a historical political enemy, right? They have been the enemies of the Republican Party. They are the ones that are preventing the Republican Party from taking full control. But I think the second and most important thing here is that the USA operates currently by identity politics, i.e., the way that the average citizen conceptualizes politics is through identity politics. We do not judge winners of politics. We do not judge who is a better government based on the policies that they give out, but rather based on how much you can tear down the other team. The reason for this is very, very simple. Because of the fact that there is increased polarization due to the media, due to things like Jubilee, due to the things like the legitimization of extremism, due to the fact that we prioritize entertainment in the USA over legitimate and sound policies. We told you that this is extremely damaging. We told you that this is extremely significant. Because what this means then is that precisely because the Republican Party is able to use theatrics, they're able to use flair, they're able to use narratives and rhetoric even better than the Democratic Party. This means that you are far more likely to want to support the Republican Party, regardless of whether or not their actual policy is good or not. This means then that the symbol, like we told you here, then that the symbolism aspect of this entire thing is even stronger. Sure.
Both guard teams forget that there are many lies that are in the propaganda machine that doesn't hurt your own party. CG literally talks about Jubilee, for example, which doesn't hurt your voter base so rapidly. Why is it the only way to engage them, and without them, the Republican Party is kaput forever?
The point here, which is very nicely, right, links to the next thing here, right? We told you about the symbolism aspect of the passing of the big, beautiful bill itself is something that is extremely empowering for the Republican Party, right? Because two tiers for this. The first tier, which is something that actually again said that went unresponded to, is that the fact that it passed through sneaky bulldozing. It passed by forcing this bill through, right? And we think that this in turn is already a first step win, right? Because it's basically Trump and the Republican Party telling people that, hey, we won the first step. Things will only get better from now on, right? People are actually likely to buy into this promise. This is an important part that the opposition teams miss, because even if the big, beautiful bill itself isn't good, the fact of the matter is you placate the public long enough for the Republican Party to come up with even better policies to actually retain their support base in the future. This actually prevents people from getting unhappy with the Republican Party in the short run. So this placation effect is actually something that is extremely important. But the additional tier here is that you tear down the Democratic Party even more. You reintroduce the Republican Party to public discourse as the winners of US politics. I think this is something that's extremely significant, because this is the first step to actually igniting MAGA support even more. Insofar as you're able to present yourselves as the winners, you can say, oh, we've taken down the Democratic Party once again. People are far more likely to buy into this narrative, insofar as other MAGA supporters are able to use this as fuel to charge out their public discourse. I think ultimately, you actually create a stronger Republican Party as a whole. For all these reasons, CG.
All right, thanks, Speaker, for that speech. Now to wrap up the op bench of the debate as a whole, I invite the op whip here.
I'll take POIs in chat, please. Yeah, no need to interrupt me during the speech. Sorry, turn off the timer. Okay. Yep. Great. Okay. O does a reasonably good job in their case of describing why a narrow portion of people are going to be turned off by this. O says that there's a certain portion of people who use government healthcare, who use things like food stamps. Those people are going to feel far worse because of the fact that those programs are cut. Two problems with the scale of this argument that I think CO is able to weigh over. The first issue is that it is factually true that extremely small portion of people in the US use these programs. I know everybody else is used to health programs that actually work, but in the US, because there are incredibly low bars for you to have things like food stamps and Medicaid cut off, it is less than 5% of the population that actually accesses these programs. And two, for the people who actually depend on these programs, the vast majority of them are already Democratic because they already know that these are programs that they depend on and don't want cut, and Republicans have messaged cutting them for the longest time. So not only are these numerically very few people, but also they're oftentimes already Democratic voters, and it doesn't really matter. Notably, O tries to claim that there's going to be bad economic effects, but given that their mechanism only applies to a very small portion of people, they don't successfully mechanize why you're actually going to create a more general recession, something that Urfaan does, and I'll get to later. And so therefore, I think that you cannot credit the full margin of economic harms to OO that they're trying to claim. Second of all, they have some stuff about how you prop up unsuccessful industries. The problem is that the reason that the industries are unsuccessful is tariffs, and those are largely symmetric. We explained to you why propping up industries, even if they're unsuccessful, propping up industries, first of all, allows them to be doing while they're nascent, good, because they can grow into fully self-sustaining industries, as is in the case with things like green energy. But two, in many cases, it's just critical for you to have voters because voters depend on these industries. So what is the contribution by CO then? First, we explained who the swing voters are, and I think everybody else is like deeply insane about who the swing voters are because you watch American news. And what that means is that you're exposed to other Americans who watch American news. But the average American doesn't watch American news. The vast majority of Americans in the US do not watch the news at all because they're very low information voters. The average person who's from a working class background has lots of other priorities in life. They want to spend time with their kids, or they have to work, in many cases, 1 or even 2 jobs. They don't have time to watch the talk shows that Gov says they'll watch. They don't have time to listen to the talk radio that Gov says is going to justify these Republican policies to them. So they oftentimes just don't listen that much to politics. How then do they make political decisions instead? They largely depend on things like daily inputs of pricing signals, whether or not they have a job, if somebody in their family has been unemployed recently, and whether or not their kids are able to do things like have a good school, whether or not they're able to afford eggs, etc. This is why they've been willing to accept all of the scandals that OG says they've been willing to accept. Yes, they've accepted a bunch of Trump sex scandals, but that's because they care about the economy above anything else, in chat only, as I said. And so the result is that it is highly unlikely that they're going to care about things like Republican messaging because they're often just not exposed to this. They don't listen that much to politics, and maybe they clue in occasionally when it's time for midterms, but that just looks like checking whether or not the economy is doing well, and if it's badly, they vote for the other side. This is literally why Biden lost, because there's a high degree of inflation during his term, not to do with his particular policies, because of external factors, and to the extent that Trump is likely to cause direct economic harm, these people are going to flip off. These people are strategically very important because oftentimes they're in swing states or in rust belts, and those are the people that this is going to lose. In particular, we think that you are likely to lose jobs, which is the most important margin in this debate, more important than those margins of social programs. Why are jobs the most important? Because there is a strong existing social narrative in the US of self-sufficiency. That is to say, you have succeeded in life if and only if you're able to provide for your family and have jobs. But critically, a lot of these jobs rely on things like government supports, as we'll explain later. And so note that government programs are stigmatized, but jobs are the things that Republicans have always promised to deliver, and you're less likely to deliver those. Jobs are also important because they have 2 second-order effects. One, they just directly provide substitutes for a lot of government programs, even if they're failing. So, for example, you get healthcare insurance by having a job in the US that's provided by your employer. But 2, oftentimes the jobs support wider communities. So, for example, the city of Detroit is supported by a few auto manufacturing plants because those support the rest of the city and enable you to have restaurants and bars, etc., allow you to have second-order positive effects. So why is this very bad for jobs? We explained to you that, first of all, you just directly cut the number of government bureaucrats by a huge portion, which means that you have a large spike in unemployment. These look like receptionists, these look like government bureaucrats, etc. But 2, you probably cut particular projects. Urfaan has given you a bunch of reasons why these projects are in important areas and important to people. I'm going to give you one extra reason, which is that these projects oftentimes require low skill. So things like building wind turbines often employs a huge number of low-skilled laborers who are the people who are the tipping point in the US who might not have jobs in the counterfactual. Things like building additional highways, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing, is critical because it is a relatively easy job for people to get into if they've been laid off by things like manufacturing moving abroad historically in the US. So these are the jobs that people counterfactually wouldn't have, and they're critical because they allow people who otherwise would jobs to support their community. This means that entire communities often go belly up. So like if you're a city that depended on a lot of green manufacturing, which is something that Biden provided, now the entire city is gone or does not economically productive anymore. And notably, when people are cutting their spending, they often cut local businesses first. So things like restaurants, farmers markets, etc., are the first to go. Which means that the small businesses, like Gov says, are the critical base for the Republicans, are the most harmed. So on the daily life, this is the most harmful. It's more harmful than government programs additionally because it reminds you every day. It affects everyone, and it's narratively important. The idea that people don't have a job anymore means that they feel like a failure. They blame the government for this. This makes them very angry. What is a counterfactual? OG and CG say that you're likely to pass policy and so people will be happy. I see your POI, I'll get to it later. The critical margin here is that we think that there are other bills that you could pass. So you could do things like have targeted tax breaks only for certain businesses instead of the broad-based tax breaks that increase the deficit. You could subsidize particular expansions and expand the IRA programs that were good. And you could do things like you've already cut 48, so you already have foreign policy accomplishments. This means that you already have things that you can sell in talk shows. This is actively harmful because it actually means that the economic performance gets worse. OG.
The marginal extension you give us is a story about the Bible Belt. But if Democrats win and they repeal tax cuts, they restore welfare and they cut mining and fracking jobs, won't voters in the ass crack of Alabama blame you for failing to pass this bill and protect their jobs and livelihoods?
Well, wait, what are you talking about? The point is that because you pass the bill, it harms their livelihoods. The Democrats are protecting these livelihoods because the Democrats also care about these voters. So the Democrats aren't going to cut their livelihoods. Also, this is all conditional on Democrats winning, in which case you've already won the debate. So, okay. Quickly on CG, they said that businesses benefit. One, it's just unclear that even if businesses get additional money, they turn this into jobs. In many cases, just the business leaders take that money away, which is not helpful for the people in the Rust Belt, who are the most populous, most large number of voters. But two, in many cases, you depend on things like manufacturing, which is larger scale businesses, which aren't that benefited by these tax cuts. And three, when you have less demand, there's less demand for these businesses, so they hire fewer people. Quickly on the donors, I just want to point out that the donors are oftentimes very negatively affected by things like decreased aggregate growth, but also because you're increasing the deficit, contrary to the purpose of this, because you have such harsh tax cuts and this ends up meaning that in many cases they know that in the long term taxes are going to have to be raised on them, so they're actively unhappy, which means that they're going to spend less money on you. Things like the chip Act cut, which means that the tech sector is unhappy. Quickly on seeming competent, you've already passed other things, so that's fine. It's quite common for you to pull in edit bills, but also you're likely to seem even more incompetent because this causes the Republican infighting. Some Republicans know that this is negative, which is why there's been fighting in the Senate. This is probably going to be exacerbated, which means that you look even worse perceptually. So proud to oppose.
All right, thanks, speaker, for that speech, and all speakers for respective speeches. This is going to mark the end of the round in the quarterfinal. You can feel free to exit the room and to wait for results announcements.